I have told exactly two people this story in my life. The first was my doctor in Nelson, a man named Dr. Franklin Coates, who had the kind of face that gave nothing away, and who listened to me describe what lived in my barn for 2 years and what it left on my porch after it was gone, and then said, very quietly, that he believed me. The second was my niece Patty, who drove up from Castlegar 3 summers ago and sat at my kitchen table and cried when I told her, not from fear, but from the feeling she described afterward as grief for a world she hadn't known existed. I am 71 years old, a childless widow. My husband Gordon passed away in the spring of 1976, and I have lived alone on this property south of Balfour ever since, on the west arm of Kootenay Lake, with the Selkirk Mountains running up the ridgeline behind my back fence and the water visible through the cedars at the end of the road. I have no children of my own. That is the one fact about my life that I carried like a stone in my coat pocket for most of my adult years. It is also the fact that explains everything that follows. Before we get into it, let me know where you're watching from and if you've had an encounter like this. I want to be clear about what I mean when I say I raise something. I am not using the word loosely. I am not talking about feeding a stray or habituating a bear cub to human presence, which the BC Ministry of Environment would rightly tell you is irresponsible and dangerous. What happened in the winter of 1980 on my property was not a managed wildlife encounter. It was a relationship. It took years, and it cost me things I cannot get back, and it gave me things I cannot explain, and it changed the landscape of everything I understood about what lives in these mountains. I had been a school teacher for 19 years when Gordon died. I taught grades 3 and 4 at Blewett Elementary, a small school on the old highway between Nelson and Balfour that served the rural families along the West Arm. Gordon was a surveyor. He worked for the provincial government, mapping timber boundaries and watershed lines in the Selkirks, spending long stretches in the field during summer and fall. When we married in 1961, we bought 15 acres south of Balfour at the end of a gravel road that went nowhere in particular. The property had a 3-bedroom house, a barn that needed work, and a woodlot that ran up the slope into crown land above the property line. Gordon fixed the barn. I planted a kitchen garden. We tried for children for 11 years before we stopped trying, and by the time we stopped, we had settled into the kind of life that finds other ways to fill itself, though the filling was never quite complete. Gordon was a quiet man, methodical in the way that surveyors often are, trained from his 20s to read land with patience. He had grown up in the Slocan Valley, the son of a carpenter, and he carried that carpenter's habit of examining things before acting on them, of measuring twice before committing. He was not demonstrative, he was present, and that is a different thing, and in my experience, a more sustaining one. When he came home from weeks in the field, he would come through the door smelling of wood smoke and canvas and the particular mineral smell of mountain creeks, and he would set his pack down by the door and look at me the way he looked at a topographic map he was satisfied with, as if everything that mattered was where he expected to find it. We built the 15 acres together as couples do when they have time and intention and no children requiring the urgency of their attention. The kitchen garden was mine, but Gordon built the raised beds from cedar planks he milled himself on weekends in the barn. The barn roof, which had been sagging when we bought the property, he resheeted over 2 weeks one September, working from a scaffolding he constructed and dismantled himself because he did not like accepting help for things he could figure out alone. The woodlot he left almost entirely to the forest, trimming only the deadfall that threatened the fence lines because he said old trees knew more about the land than we did, and the polite thing was to let them continue knowing it. I used to walk the property with him on Sunday mornings when the weather permitted. The Selkirks behind the back fence rose in the first light with a quality that I never got used to. The snow on the upper ridges going pink before the valley below had any light at all. Gordon would name what he saw, the species of trees, the soil types, the way the drainage from the upper slope collected in the low corner of the back paddock, and explained why the grass there was greener than anywhere else. He taught me to read the land as he had learned to read it. not as scenery but as information. The kokanee in the creek, the osprey coming to the lake in April, how the snow came off the north-facing slopes 2 weeks later than the south-facing ones. These were not observations. They were a system, and Gordon understood systems. When we stopped trying for children, we did not talk about it much. This was not avoidance. It was a mutual recognition that talking would not produce what trying had not produced, and that what remained was still considerable. We had the 15 acres, we had the Sunday mornings, we had the particular companionship of two people who have spent enough years together that silence is not absence, but its own kind of presence. I understand now that I was practicing for a form of companionship that would come much later, conducted in a different silence, across a different kind of distance. But I did not know that then. I was simply a woman in a good marriage, in a good place, with the particular ache of the thing that was not there sitting alongside everything that was. Gordon's death was sudden, a cerebral aneurysm, on a Tuesday morning in April, in the parking lot of the Nelson Post Office. He was 42 years old. I was teaching a spelling lesson when the principal came to my classroom door, and I knew from the look on his face before he said a word. After the funeral, I stayed in the house. People expected me to sell and move to town, and I understood why they expected that. A woman alone on 15 acres at the end of a gravel road, with winters that could cut the road off for days at a stretch, was not an obviously sensible arrangement. But the house was Gordon's work as much as mine. His hands were in the walls and the fence posts and the repaired barn roof, and I was not ready to leave the place where his hands had been. I kept teaching. I kept the kitchen garden. I ordered a cord of firewood every October and I stacked it myself. I was not unhappy exactly. I was alone, and there is a difference between the two things that most people who have not been widowed do not appreciate. The first winter was the hardest, not because of the practical difficulties, though there were those, the firewood ordering, the truck maintenance, the fence repairs that Gordon had always handled in autumn and that I had to learn by doing, with results that were serviceable if not elegant. The hardest thing was the evenings. Gordon had not been a talker, but he had been a presence, and the presence had organized the evenings in a way I had not consciously noticed while it was there. Without it, the time between dinner and bed became a space I did not know how to fill. I read more than I had in years. I took to listening to the radio in the kitchen, not for any particular program, but for the company of voices. I stayed later at school, marking papers at my desk when I could have taken them home, because the staff room had people in it, and my house did not. The community along the West Arm was not indifferent. The women from the Blewett School, Barbara Teal and Lorraine Knox, who had both taught there for longer than I had, brought food the first week and checked in through the winter with the unsentimental efficiency of women who have watched other women absorb this kind of loss and know the shape of what is needed. The man who had sold us the property originally, an older fella named Alf Sorensen who ran a small sawmill operation on the highway, came by in November with a load of split wood that he stacked against the south wall of the barn without being asked and without billing me. I thanked him, and he said Gordon had been a good neighbor and a careful man, and that he had been sorry to hear it. This passed for eulogy in that part of the world, and I received it as the full-weight thing it was.
Quick thing before we get into it. I have a book coming out. It's called the Bigfoot Codex. It's a compilation of all my research and findings. It's kind of my baby. So if you want to check it out, links down below. Now let's get you back to the video.
The property kept me sane through those years. The requirement of land does not accommodate grief as a primary occupation. The garden needed planting in May regardless of how I felt about May. The firewood needed stacking in September. The creek needed checking after heavy rain to see if the drainage ditch at the road had backed up. The fence between my back paddock and the crown land above needed walking after winter to find where the snowpack had pushed posts out of true. These were Gordon's jobs that became my jobs, and doing them was its own form of conversation with him, or with what he had made of the place. I learned to use the post pounder. I learned to reset a fence staple. I learned that the drainage ditch needed clearing of cottonwood debris every October, or it would back up by December, which I discovered the hard way in the second winter, when water pooled in the low corner of the garden and froze into a sheet I had to chip apart with a mattock over 3 mornings in January. By the fall of 1979, 3 years after the funeral, I had arrived at the particular equilibrium that widows who remain alone eventually reach, if they are going to reach it at all. It is not happiness and it is not resignation. It is more practical than either. A settled recognition that this is the life and the life is sufficient, and the task is to live it well. I was 54 years old. I had 22 children in my classroom and a kitchen garden that was producing better than it ever had because I was paying it more attention, and a property on Kootenay Lake with the Selkirks behind it that was as beautiful in the early morning light as it had ever been. That was the autumn I started noticing the fish. Teaching, for those who stay at it long enough, becomes a form of attention management. You learn to read a room of children as you learn to read a sky, not by looking at any one detail, but by taking the whole thing in at once and letting the pattern tell you what it means. A child who is about to cry holds their chin differently than a child who is simply tired. A child who does not understand but is too proud to say so has a very specific quality of stillness, a performed attentiveness that a teacher of 20-odd years can identify before the child even knows they are performing it. I had been doing this reading so long that it had become involuntary, as a physician's eyes go automatically to a patient's complexion and gait even in a casual encounter. What I had not understood until the autumn of 1979 was that I was also doing it on the property. Gordon had taught me to read the land as information, and without consciously applying that training, I had been reading the woodlot and the creek and the fence lines for years with the same involuntary attention I brought to the classroom. I knew when the creek ran higher than seasonal precipitation could explain. There was a spring upslope that fed it in dry years, and I had learned to read the creek height as information about the water table above the property. I knew which fence posts held and which were soft at the base from the wet season frost heave. I knew that the osprey who used the dead snag above the shore left in mid-September, and that this year he had left a week early, which meant the Kootenay run had peaked and declined faster than usual. What I did not know, in the fall of '79, was that this accumulated knowledge of my own property was about to become the tool I needed to understand what was happening on it. The missing fish from the creek, the unusual tracks, the structure in the cedars, these were legible to me precisely because I had been paying attention for years before they appeared. A person who did not know the Kootenay run or the ordinary state of the creek bank would not have noticed the discrepancy. I noticed it because the property was a text I had been reading long enough to know when a new sentence appeared that had not been there before. The November before I found Birch in the barn, I remember sitting in the barn itself on a Saturday afternoon, doing nothing in particular, just sitting in the quiet of the old building with the smell of dust and cedar and dry hay around me. I had come out to find a box of Gordon's field tools that I thought might be in the storage area. I found the box and then I stayed. For no reason I could articulate, simply because the barn was quiet and I was in the mood for quiet. I sat on the same straw bale that would become my regular seat over the following years. Outside the barn I could hear the Selkirks, which sounds like a strange thing to say. Mountains do not make sounds, but what I mean is that I could hear the quality of silence that the mountains produce on their windward slopes. A particular muffled quality that distinguishes the silence of terrain from the silence of open ground. I sat in the barn and I listened to that silence, and I did not know yet that I was listening for anything in particular. I only know now, looking back, that I was. The barn had already been chosen, by whatever process guides such choosing, before anyone had entered it who had not been invited. I was simply the last to know. In the fall of 1979, 3 years after Gordon died, I began to notice things around the property that I could not account for. This was not an immediate revelation. It built slowly, the way understanding usually does, through an accumulation of small things that do not individually demand explanation, but that, taken together, stop making sense. It began with the creek. There is a small tributary that runs off the ridge above my woodlot, crossing the back corner of my property before emptying into a drainage ditch along the road. In late August and early September, kokanee salmon use that creek to spawn. They come in from Kootenay Lake, small and brilliant in their spawning colors, and for about 3 weeks the creek is alive with them. I had watched this every year since we bought the property, but that September, something was taking the fish. Not bears, who leave a specific mess, scales and spine fragments and the heavy smell of fish oil pressed into the bank mud. What I found beside the creek was different. The fish were being removed cleanly, carried off whole, and the tracks in the soft bank mud beside the water were not the wide, clawed prints of a black bear. They were bipedal, long and narrow, deeply pressed, with individual toes defined in the mud. I measured one with a ruler from the kitchen, 17 inches long, 9 inches across at the widest point. The stride between prints, which I measured by following them from the creek bank up toward the woodlot, was close to 5 feet. I stood in my woodlot with the tape measure in my hand and looked up at the ridge and felt the quiet that had been sitting in the back of my awareness for weeks settle into that vague awareness crystallizing into a clearer shape. Whatever was taking the kokanee, it was big, it walked on 2 legs, and it had been doing this regularly enough that it had a clear path worn into the underbrush between the creek and the tree line above my property. I went back to the creek 4 times over the following 2 weeks. Each time I told myself I was going to check the drainage, or to see whether the kokanee run had fully ended, or simply to take the air. Each time I was going to look at the tracks again. The mud held them well into late September because that corner of the property is in shade by 2 in the afternoon and the bank stays damp. By my 3rd visit, a light rain had softened the edges of the oldest prints, but the most recent ones were sharp, pressed within the previous 48 hours. Whatever was making them was using the creek regularly. I brought a notebook. I measured everything I could think to measure. The stride length was 4 feet 11 inches at its shortest and 5 feet 3 at its longest, which told me the stride was not consistent, the way it would be if someone were walking steadily, but variable, as it is when a being is picking its path along a bank and adjusting for the terrain. The toe impressions were distinct. 5 toes, no claws, the big toe set close to the others rather than splayed wide as a bear's foot splays. The depth ranged from 2 inches in the softer mud to just under an inch on firmer ground, which gave me a rough sense of the weight distribution. I had grown up in the Kootenays. I knew what a black bear print looked like, what an elk print looked like, what a human print looked like. None of these was any of those things. In the underbrush above the creek bank, I found the path more clearly on my 4th visit, when I brought a better flashlight and went up just before dusk. It was not a game trail. Game trails in dense underbrush have a low, narrow profile. Deer and elk push through at their own height, and the vegetation closes above. This path was wide, the branches broken or bent at a height of about 7 feet, with a ground-level clearance suggesting presence far above deer height. The path turned at a precise point about 40 yards up the slope and headed northwest toward the densest section of the old-growth cedar block at the back of my woodlot, the stand where Gordon and I had always left the trees alone. I followed the turn to the edge of the cedars and then stopped. The light was going, and the tree line above the property was dark and very quiet. I stood there for a few minutes, listening. The kokanee had finished spawning, and the creek was low and almost silent. The osprey that had been fishing the lake all summer had gone south 2 weeks earlier. The forest above me was the ordinary silence of a Kootenay autumn evening, the kind of silence you stop noticing after you have lived in it long enough. Except I was noticing it now. I was noticing it because I understood, standing at the edge of those cedars with my notebook and my measuring tape, that the silence was not absence. It was the presence of a being that had decided to stop moving until I left. I did not call anyone. I told myself this was because I did not know who to call. The Ministry of Environment managed wildlife in BC, but what I had found was not a nuisance bear or a problem cougar. The tracks did not fit anything in any category I knew. The rational explanation, the one I kept returning to, was that a person had been coming through my property to fish the creek. A very large person with very large feet who walked with an unusually long stride. I knew this was not sufficient. The depth of those prints, pressed into mud that my own boot barely marked, indicated a weight that no person I could imagine would carry. But rationalization is remarkably persistent when the alternative refuses to fit inside any rational category. In November of that year, I found the first structure. I had gone up into the woodlot to check on a section of back fence that had been bothering me, and on my way back I cut through a dense stand of old-growth western red cedar that Gordon and I had always left alone. Trees that were 4 feet across at the base and old enough that their lower branches had been dead for a century. Between 2 of the largest cedars, a nest had been built there. That is the only word for it. A roughly circular depression about 8 feet across had been cleared of debris, and the interior was lined with broken cedar boughs, dry fern, and what looked like stripped inner bark from a nearby cottonwood. The construction was deliberate. The boughs were layered in a pattern that shed rain from the center, with the tips pointing outward. I knelt beside it and pressed my hand into the interior. The ground inside was warmer than the surrounding forest floor, from retained body heat, and there was an odor. Heavy, musky, organic, not unpleasant but deeply foreign, the smell of an animal I had no reference for. I circled the nest without touching it. The depression at the center was clear of debris to the bare earth, and the lining of cedar boughs covered an area of about 60 square feet, pressed and flattened by repeated use. There were impressions in the softer ground at the nest's edge that matched the prints from the creek bank. The same broad, 5-toed shape, slightly smaller here, as if the being had been sitting rather than walking with full weight. Around the perimeter of the construction, I found small things that were not natural to the site. A section of dried bark that had been stripped in a single clean pull rather than weathered off. Several long dark hairs caught on the rough edge of the cedar trunk nearest the nest, each one over 6 inches long and considerably coarser than deer or bear. I took 2 of the hairs and folded them into a page of my notebook. I looked at them later under the lamp at my kitchen table and could not identify them. They were not hair from any animal I knew, not in color, not in texture, not in how they caught and held the light. I went back to the nest twice more before the snow came. Both times it had been used since my previous visit. The cedar bough lining had been refreshed, new branches woven into the compression of the old ones. The central depression was always warm to the touch, or warmer than the surrounding ground, even hours after use. The smell was always present, that musky organic richness, and it intensified in the second week of November when the nights dropped well below freezing, and the smell seemed to concentrate and hang in the still cold air beneath the cedars. I did not tell anyone. This was not a considered decision. There was simply no conversation I could construct that ended well. I could call the Ministry of Environment and report evidence of an unknown large bipedal animal nesting in my woodlot, which would bring people with clipboards who would either dismiss the evidence or not dismiss it, and neither outcome seemed desirable. I could mention it to Barbara Teal or Lorraine Knox at school, but they would think I was describing a black bear, and explaining why it was not a black bear would require more of myself than I was prepared to give. The information was mine. I held it as information and I waited. What changed in those November weeks, in ways that I am still examining 40 years later, was the way I moved on my own land. I had been walking this property for 18 years with the comfortable inattention of someone at home in a place. After the nest, I walked it differently, not with fear exactly, though fear was part of it, with awareness. I noticed the woodlot sounds with a precision I had not previously applied. I noted when the birds fell silent in the upper cedars and when they resumed. I watched the deer trail that crossed the back fence for signs of disruption. I began checking the flat rock beside the barn door each morning, not because I had any reason to expect it to hold information, but because it seemed like the kind of surface that information might be left on. I was learning to pay attention to my own property as if it were a text I had not previously known how to read. Quick thing before we get into it. A lot of what I've learned about Bigfoot doesn't fit into these videos, so I put it all in a book. It's called the Bigfoot Codex. If you ever want more, it's linked below. Either way, let's get into the story. December came, the creek froze, the Kootenays were long gone. I saw no further tracks. I half convinced myself that whatever had been on the property had moved on to other territory for the winter, as bears do, and I let myself settle back into the ordinary rhythms of the cold months. Firewood, marking papers, the short days that come so early to the lake with the mountains blocking the afternoon light by 2:30.
Then, on the 4th of January, 1980, I found it in the barn. The barn sits about 60 feet from the house, at the edge of the woodlot. I had not kept animals in it since Gordon died, but I used it for storage, and I went out that morning to find a second bag of salt for the front steps. The barn has 2 large doors at the front and a smaller door at the side that I leave unlatched because the hinges are old and forcing a latch risks pulling them loose. I went in through the side door with a flashlight because the barn has no electricity, and I stepped inside and moved my light across the space, and in the far corner, behind the old stall partition, something moved. I want to tell you what I felt in that moment because it is important for understanding everything that came after. I did not run, I do not know exactly why. There was fear, certainly, a cold flush of it that started at the back of my neck and ran to the soles of my feet.
But underneath the fear was a second thing, arriving at the same instant, and it was the recognition that whatever was in that corner was not threatening me. The movement I had seen was not a lunge or a charge, it was a flinch. The movement of a frightened being. I held the flashlight steady and moved toward the stall partition slowly, the way you approach any animal you are uncertain of, and I looked over the top of the partition. The flashlight beam was a 4-cell lantern beam, wide and strong, and it filled the stall completely. The first thing I saw was not a shape, but a pair of eyes. They were set at a height that was too tall for any animal that belonged in a barn, and they caught the light the way eyes do in the dark, with a reddish-gold reflection that lasted only a second before the head turned slightly and the reflection vanished. But in that second, the distance between those eyes registered, wide-set, human-proportioned, looking back at me with an attention that I absorbed before I fully absorbed what I was looking at. Then the shape resolved. It had drawn itself back against the far corner of the stall when the flashlight hit it, pressing into the angle where the 2 walls met, and it was pressing now with its hands flat against both walls and its head down, the chin tucked, which I later understood was a posture of submission rather than aggression, the same posture a dog takes when it does not want to be approached. Its breath was visible in the cold barn air, short, controlled puffs. It was managing its own fear with a deliberateness that told me the fear was real and the management was also real. The smell hit me fully then. In the first seconds of shock, I had not fully registered it, but as I stood at the partition with my flashlight and my thundering pulse and my complete inability to categorize what I was seeing, the smell reached me. That same musky organic richness from the nest, but warmer, more concentrated, the living version of it, emanating from a body generating heat at a rate I could feel from 4 feet away. It was not a threatening smell. It was the smell of a large, healthy body in cold air, of dense hair that had absorbed the forest as wool absorbs rain. It was the size of the hands that organized everything else I was looking at. The hands pressed against the stall walls were splayed for stability, long fingers braced against the old plank boards, and they were large enough that the palm alone spanned what I estimated as 11 or 12 inches. The knuckles were prominent, the skin on the back of the hand darker than the hair on the arms, leathery and thick. These were working hands, shaped by whatever a life in this terrain required of them. They did not look delicate, but their placement, that carefully controlled pressure against the wall as a communication of stillness, was not aggressive. It was the gesture of a being that did not want to be misunderstood. I do not know how long I stood there at the partition, long enough that my arm, extended with the flashlight, began to fatigue. I lowered it slightly, and the beam angle changed, and the young Sasquatch flinched at the movement, pressing harder into the corner, and I understood that the light itself was frightening. I angled the beam toward the floor between us, so neither of us was looking directly into it, and in the dimmer reflected light, I could see better than I had in the direct beam, could see the heave and settle of its breathing, could see how its eyes, no longer confronting the direct beam, returned to mine with a wariness that held another quality beneath it. Assessment, the same look a person gives you when they are deciding whether to trust a situation they did not choose. I have spent considerable time since then trying to decide how to describe what I saw in that barn, and the difficulty is not in the description itself, but in the ordering of it. When you see something for the first time that you have no framework for, your eye does not know where to begin. You take in fragments, and your mind assembles them after the fact, and the assembly is always imperfect. What I can tell you is this: it was young. That was the first thing I registered, not its size or its hair or the shape of its face, but its youth. It was huddled in the corner of the stall with its knees pulled to its chest and its arms wrapped around itself, and the posture was the posture of a young thing that had been cold and alone for too long and was trying to make itself smaller than it was. It was covered in hair, dark chestnut brown, dense and long on its shoulders and back, finer and shorter on its face and the palms of its hands. The hands were what stopped my breath. They were pressed flat against the stall boards on either side of its body, and they were the hands of a being that was not human but was not far from human either. Long fingers, wide palms, opposable thumbs, set at an angle that was slightly different from mine. But the proportion, the gesture of those pressed hands was familiar. The recognition arrived in my chest rather than my head. Its face. I need you to understand that I am a practical woman. I was 55 years old and had spent 3 decades teaching other people's children and managing a property alone and making decisions with the information available rather than waiting for certainty. I am not a person who embroiders. What I saw in that face was intelligence. Not the intelligence of a dog or a bear, animals whose cognition I had some familiarity with. More than that, an awareness that registered my presence as a specific person rather than as a category of threat. It was watching me with eyes that were dark, deeply set beneath a brow that was heavier than a human brow, and in those eyes was a wariness that was calculating rather than simply panicked. It was deciding what I was. It was injured. Once I had absorbed the fact of what I was looking at, the injury became the most urgent thing in the room. Its left arm was held at an angle that was not right, pressed tight against its body, and there was dark staining on the hair of its shoulder and upper arm that I recognized as dried blood. It had been bleeding. It had found its way into my barn, into the warmest enclosed space on my property, and it had been there for at least several hours based on the compacted nest of loose hay it had arranged around itself. I backed out of the stall slowly. I went to the house. I sat at my kitchen table for a long time. I need to explain what I was weighing in those minutes because the decision I made in that kitchen is the one everything else follows from. I could call the Ministry of Environment, the RCMP, someone with authority and protocols, and then whatever was in my barn became a problem to be managed, documented, contained. I had no idea what the authorities would do with an injured juvenile Sasquatch, but the word specimen entered my mind and did not leave. Or I could do what I knew how to do. I had taken a first aid course. I had treated enough scraped knees and minor cuts in 20 years of teaching to understand the basics of wound care. The injury appeared to be to the arm or shoulder. I had supplies in the house. I had food. I had a barn that was private and enclosed and warm enough to be survivable. I went back to the barn with a basin of warm water, a clean towel, Gordon's old first aid kit, and a plate of cold venison from the previous night's dinner. It took 3 visits over the course of that first day before it allowed me close enough to examine the injury. Each time I moved to the same spot beside the stall partition, set what I had brought on the floor, and sat on the straw bale across the aisle. On the first visit, it stayed pressed into the corner. On the second, the venison was gone, though I had not seen it move. On the third, late in the afternoon with the light going gray outside the barn doors, it shifted toward the plate I had left and looked at me directly for the first time. And I looked back, and neither of us moved for several minutes. The injury was a deep gash across the upper left arm and into the shoulder. I could see this by the end of that third visit because it had moved close enough, or I had, that my flashlight illuminated the wound clearly. It had been caused by a sharp edge driven with enough force to cut deeply through the dense hair and the muscle beneath. My best guess, then and since, was the branch of a blowdown, a tree that had snapped under ice load and left a jagged spike of broken wood at about chest height for a being of that size. The wound was not infected yet, but it would be without attention. I went inside and ate dinner and thought about the problem. I was not a veterinarian. The tools I had were human first aid tools, scaled for human injuries. The main concern was infection and blood loss, and the blood loss appeared to have stabilized on its own, which told me it had reasonable coagulative response, at least similar enough to mammalian norms to function. For infection, I had antiseptic and clean cloth, and the ability to clean and cover the wound if it would let me. The if was the entire problem. I went out at dusk with the lamp from my bedside table and a thermos of warm broth that I poured into a shallow bowl. I set the bowl inside the stall, close to where it was sitting. I sat on the straw bale. I was there for almost an hour before it bent forward and drank the broth. And when it looked up at me, its breath fogged in the cold air and its eyes caught the lamplight and stopped me from thinking anything at all for a moment. Just stopped me completely. On the morning of the 5th of January, I cleaned the wound. This was the most significant event in our relationship's first phase, and I want to describe it carefully because it was the moment when the terms of things were established between us. I went into the barn with my supplies, and I sat in my usual place on the straw bale, and I set the basin of warm water on the floor between us. I dipped the cloth in the water and wrung it out, and I held it up where it could see. I was showing it what I intended to do. I did not reach toward it, I waited. It watched the cloth. After a while, it shifted very slightly in my direction, perhaps 2 inches, and I understood this as permission. I moved to the floor beside it slowly, close enough to reach the shoulder. The smell at close range was dense and warm and animal, not unpleasant, the smell of a healthy living thing that lives outdoors. I pressed the damp cloth against the edge of the wound and it made a sound, not a cry, not a growl. A deep exhalation, a controlled sound that I interpreted as a response to pain, and it did not pull away. I cleaned the wound. It held still. When I was finished and had pressed the clean folded cloth against the gash, it turned its head and looked at me from a distance of perhaps 18 inches. I came back the next morning with fresh water and more antiseptic and what I had found in the bathroom cabinet. A tube of drawing salve that I had used years before for a splinter Gordon had driven deep into his palm during the barn repairs. I was not certain it would help, but I was not certain it would harm, and doing nothing felt worse than trying. The wound was clean. No discharge, the edges beginning to show the first faint signs of that rapid knitting I would observe more clearly over the following days. I applied the salve. Birch watched my hands the entire time with the focused attention of someone watching a procedure they want to understand. Not flinching, not looking away, watching. By the 3rd day, I had worked out a protocol, if that is not too formal a word for what was essentially a series of negotiations conducted in silence. I would set the supplies on the floor first, then sit back on the straw bale, then wait. The waiting was the signal that I was not going to advance until invited. At some point in each visit, different each day, earlier each day, Birch would shift his weight or angle his shoulder toward me, and I took this as the invitation. I moved slowly. I narrated what I was doing in a low voice, not because I thought he understood the words, but because a calm voice seemed to be information he was receiving and processing. And I worked on the wound and then withdrew to the straw bale again. The routine of it mattered. He was learning the pattern and the pattern was learning him. On the fifth day, I had a genuine concern. The wound was not infected, but the tissue had closed faster at the surface than it had in the deeper layers, and I was worried about a pocket of fluid forming beneath the skin. In a human patient, I would have referred this immediately. I had no referral to make. I cleaned the surface carefully and applied pressure for longer than usual and watched. And the next morning when I went back, the area had resolved on its own, characteristic, I later understood, of his biology. His body was not following the timeline my training had given me. It was following its own, which was considerably faster. On the seventh day, he let me sit beside him rather than across the aisle. This was the most significant moment of that first week, more than any specific clinical milestone. He shifted himself along the stall wall and left a space beside him and looked at me, and I sat in the space. We were, for the first time, side by side, rather than across from each other. I could feel the heat coming off his body at that proximity, a dry, radiant warmth that was not fever but metabolism, a metabolism running hotter than a human body runs. I cleaned the wound from beside him rather than from in front of him, which required some awkward positioning of my arms, but I did it because changing the configuration seemed important to him, and therefore important to me. He smelled different up close than he smelled from across the stall. Closer to the body, the scent was less of the forest and more of a clean animal warmth, the smell of a hide that is healthy and well-maintained, slightly warm, faintly sweet, the way cedar is slightly sweet. There was no sourness to it, no illness, none of the chemical undertones that come with infection or stress. He was, despite the injury and the cold and whatever had brought him to my barn, in good condition. And what I saw in its face was an expression I had seen on children's faces on the first day of school. The particular combination of wariness and tentative relief that arrives when a frightening thing turns out to be tolerable. I named it Birch. Not as a permanent designation, not with any ownership intended. I needed something to call it in my mind, in my journal, in the private accounting I was keeping. The birch trees along the creek had been the last thing I saw clearly before I went into the barn that first morning. Silver white against the dark cedars, standing in the gray January light. The name seemed right for a thing that had come out of the forest at the edge of winter. Over the following weeks, a routine established itself that I can only describe as domestic, though the word feels inadequate. Birch remained in the barn. I came out 4 times a day, morning, noon, late afternoon, and before I turned in, and I brought food each time. The wound on its arm healed at a rate that stopped me. Within 10 days, the tissue was knitting on a schedule that should have taken 3 weeks at minimum in a human patient. By the end of January, it was moving the arm freely, reaching up to push against the stall boards, pulling itself to standing with both arms. The hair around the wound grew back with a density that covered the scar within 6 weeks of the injury. I say it, and I need to explain why, because I had no clear sense of Birch's sex in those early months. The hair coverage made visual assessment impossible, and I was not about to attempt a clinical examination of a being only beginning to tolerate my presence. I used the neutral pronoun from the beginning and kept to it for the first year. Later, I came to understand that Birch was male based on behavioral patterns that became clear over time, but that is much further into the story. What Birch ate was my first practical challenge. I had a chest freezer in the back porch stocked through hunting season and the butcher in Nelson, and I began pulling from it for Birch, supplemented by the IGA in Balfour, venison mostly. He ate everything I offered: apples from the mudroom storage box, dried beans, beets from the root cellar, oats he consumed raw by the handful, but meat was the priority. He did not touch bread or milk in any form. He ate prodigious amounts, and by February I was making an extra trip to Nelson every week simply to keep pace. The cold was the other concern.
January in the Kootenays is not the coldest cold there is. We do not get the interior BC temperatures of Kamloops or Prince George, but overnight lows in the -15 to -20 Celsius range are common on the West Arm, and the barn was insulated only by its own mass. I brought out the 2 wool blankets that Gordon had used in the field, heavy surplus military blankets that I had kept in the linen closet, and I left them folded in the stall. I did not drape them over him. I left them there for him to use as he chose. The next morning, both blankets were wrapped around him in a configuration that told me he understood their purpose precisely. By mid-February, Birch was coming out of the stall. Not out of the barn, not at first, but out of the stall and into the broader barn space, moving along the far wall and inspecting the stored equipment, the old garden tools, the boxes of Gordon's surveying gear that I had never been able to bring myself to sell. He handled these things with a care that I found striking. He would pick up an object, turn it in those long-fingered hands, examine it from several angles, set it down where he had found it. He never damaged anything. The shovel, the pruning saw, the coil of fence wire, each was examined and returned. One morning in late February, I came in to find him sitting on the barn floor with Gordon's old compass in his hands. It was a good compass, a Brunton, the kind Gordon had used for his survey work, with a brass housing and a mirror lid. Birch had the lid open and was holding the compass level, watching the needle swing and settle. He did this for perhaps 5 minutes while I stood in the barn doorway watching. Then he held the compass out toward me, not offering it exactly, but presenting it in the same gesture you might use to show someone something you had noticed that you thought they should also notice. I walked over and sat down beside him and took the compass and held it level and watched the needle north. He watched it too, his head slightly tilted. When I handed it back to him, he closed the lid and set it down on the exact square of floor where he had found it. That evening, sitting at my kitchen table with my journal open, I wrote, "He is not a child, but he is not fully formed. He is something in between. And whatever that something is, it has been watching the world with a thoroughness that I find humbling." There were things I noticed about him over those winter months that I recorded in the journal, but that I will tell you here because they mattered more than they might seem to. He was curious about sound. Not just the sounds of the forest outside the barn, which he tracked with an attentiveness that turned his head toward the walls as precisely as a compass needle, but the sounds inside the barn. The ones I made and the ones the barn itself made. On a windy night in late January, the loose tin sheeting on the northwest corner of the roof began its usual complaining, a metallic rattle and moan that I had been meaning to have fixed since the previous fall. Birch spent nearly an hour that night examining the far corner of the barn interior, pressing his palm flat against the wall boards and tilting his head at different angles, clearly trying to locate the source of the sound inside the structure. When I climbed up on a stool and pressed the tin firmly to stop the rattle, he watched me do it. The next day I found that the outside corner of the sheeting had been bent carefully back against the barn wall and wedged in place with a section of branch. He had gone outside in the night and fixed the roof. He was curious about fire. Not dangerously. He never attempted to light anything or to interfere with the small kerosene lamp I brought to the barn in the evenings. But he watched the flame with the concentrated attention of a being that had a relationship with fire that was different from what any wild animal would have. He watched it the way a person watches a fire, which is to say he watched it with a kind of recognition. Once, when the wick burned low and the flame began to gutter, he made a brief sound and looked at me and then looked at the lamp. And I understood that he was telling me the lamp needed attention. He had noticed before I had. He arranged things. This is the habit I found most striking and most difficult to categorize. When he was in the barn for an extended period without me, he would sometimes rearrange the items along the far wall of the storage area, not randomly, but in patterns that suggested a logic I could not always read. The garden tools, which had been hung on a row of nails in no particular order, were at some point sorted by length. The stacked boxes of Gordon's survey equipment were shifted so that the labeled sides faced outward. None of this was asked of him.
None of it served any obvious purpose I could identify. It looked like the organizing behavior of someone who was making sense of a space by imposing a system on it. In February, I found a drawing, or what functioned as one. On the inside surface of one of the stall boards, where the wood was smooth and pale from years of sheltered air, there were lines made in what I later determined was ash from the wood I had been burning in the small camp stove I'd set up for warmth in the barn. Lines drawn with a finger, precise and deliberate. They resolved, when I held the lamp close, into a rough approximation of the barn's interior layout. The stall, the large door, the smaller side door, the storage area, the rough position of the lamp on the hook. A map. A representation of the space in which he was living, committed to the wood with the materials available. I stood with the lamp and looked at that drawing for a considerable time. Then I went back to the house and I sat down and I understood that I needed to significantly revise my assumptions about what I was dealing with. I should clarify what I mean by juvenile. Birch, when I found him, stood close to 5 feet tall. By the end of that first winter, he had grown to close to 5.5. His proportions were different from a human adolescence, broader through the shoulders and thicker through the chest relative to his height, with arms that were longer than they should have been, and hands that were already larger than mine. His face, when I had opportunity to observe it at close range, which happened with increasing frequency as the weeks went on, had the softness around the jaw and brow that I associated with youth in any mammal, a quality that would not last. He was, I believe, somewhere between 8 and 12 years old in whatever calendar his species measured by. But that is speculation, and I want to be clear when I am speculating and when I am describing what I observed. March came, and with it the first significant thaw of the year. The snow on the roof began to slide in the afternoons, crashing onto the ground in slabs, and the creek at the back of the property rose with snowmelt. On the first Thursday in March, I went to the barn in the morning and found the side door open and Birch gone. I stood in the empty barn for a long time. The blankets were folded on the stall floor. The nest of hay he had built around himself over the winter was pressed flat and cold. He had been gone for hours, possibly since before dawn. I told myself that this was natural, that whatever had kept him here through the cold months had dissolved with the season's turn, and he had gone back to where he came from. I told myself I should be glad of this, that it was the correct outcome, that a wild thing returning to its territory was precisely what ought to happen. I went inside and sat at my kitchen table and did not eat breakfast and stared at the wall for a very long time. He came back that afternoon. I heard him before I saw him, a series of soft thumps against the barn wall that had become the sound I associated with his moving around inside. I went out and he was back in the barn, sitting in his usual place in the stall. He had brought an offering with him. Laid on the stall floor in front of him, arranged with a deliberateness that was impossible to miss, were several large fish. Kootenay Lake bull trout by the size and coloring. The lake had not yet frozen solid in the shallows by late winter, and there were places along the shore where ice-free water gathered above the springs. He had been to the lake, and he had come back and he had brought dinner. I cooked the trout for both of us. I ate mine in the house and brought his out on a plate, the way I always did, and he ate in the stall, the way he always did. But a shift had occurred in the arrangement, quietly, without either of us naming it. He had left, he had come back, he had brought food. The relationship was no longer primarily one of care and dependency. It was becoming more symmetrical. Spring opened the Kootenays the way it always does in that country. Reluctantly at first and then with a rush. The cedars greening up in April, the cottonwoods breaking bud along the creek in long yellow-green streamers, the lake throwing off the last of its winter color and going blue again. Birch began spending time out of the barn, ranging the woodlot and beyond, disappearing for hours before returning. I did not follow him and I did not track where he went, partly from instinct and partly because I understood that what I was watching was normal development, a young thing expanding its world as young things do. He returned to the barn to sleep each night that first spring.
I had given up trying to understand this exactly and had simply accepted it as the current state of things, the same way I accepted the apple blossoms or the osprey that came to the lake in April. Some things do not require explanation. They require attention. By May, I began to understand that Birch had opinions. This sounds like a small observation, but it was not. Opinions require a model of the world that includes preferences, which requires a sense of self that extends beyond the moment. What I mean is this: there were things he wanted and things he did not want, and the distinction was clear and consistent and not governed simply by hunger or fear. He wanted the barn door left open during the day and closed at night. He wanted the lamp lit when I came out after dark and extinguished when I left. He did not want me in the barn when there were sounds from the woodlot above the property, a prohibition he communicated through a specific low vocalization that I came to understand as "stay back" or close to it. He did not want the red wool blanket which he abandoned in favor of Gordon's old green canvas sleeping bag that he found in the storage area in March and claimed immediately. He also had opinions about me. By June of that first year, he had begun to initiate contact rather than simply tolerating it. He would present an object to me, a stone, a piece of bark, a feather, and watch my response with an attention that told me the response mattered. He would follow me to the door of the barn and stand there watching me cross the yard to the house, which I took as some form of tracking, a desire to know where I was going. Once, when I was chopping wood at the woodpile beside the barn, and my axe slipped and I cut my forearm on the upswing, not badly but enough to bleed, Birch was at the barn door within seconds and made a sound I had not heard before, a rising tone that I can only describe as alarm. He watched me press my sleeve against the cut, and he watched the bleeding stop. And only then did he retreat back into the barn, and even then he came to check on me twice more before noon. The summer of 1980 was the summer I learned what it felt like to be accompanied. I had not felt that since Gordon died. Not the same as having a companion, not the same social contract at all, but the simpler thing that comes before it. The knowledge that a presence nearby was aware of your existence and oriented toward you. Walking the property in the mornings with Birch, moving through the woodlot above me, visible sometimes as a dark shape between the cedars, not following exactly but keeping pace. The same pull toward mutual awareness that you feel with a dog who is ranging but watching. I was not his owner. I was not his mother. I was the person who had been in the barn in January, and whatever calculus his mind ran, that fact had established a bond that we were both, in our own ways, navigating. That summer I began to understand the scope of his territory. He was ranging, in his daytime absences, over a considerable area. I knew this from what he brought back. A bull trout from a section of the lake that was a good 3 miles from the property. Identifiable because of the particular clay composition of the mud still damp on the fish's scales. Berries from the high slopes, Saskatoon berries and high bush blueberries that do not grow below about 2,000 feet elevation, which meant he was going up into the subalpine in his wanderings. Twice in midsummer, I heard in the far distance above the property a sound that I recognized as his chest-tone vocalizations, coming from the direction of the high ridge, and then the carrying sounds of what might have been a response, different in timbre and somewhat lower in pitch. He was not alone in his wider territory, even if the barn was where he chose to sleep. In July, I went to Kootenay Lake on a Saturday morning to swim, which I had done every summer since we bought the property. I drove down to the public access point at Balfour and spent an hour in the water and then drove back. And as I turned onto my road, I saw Birch for the first time in daylight outside the barn. He was at the edge of the woodlot, just inside the fence line, and he was watching the road, watching for me. He withdrew into the trees when he saw the truck, smoothly and without apparent alarm, and by the time I had parked and walked to the barn, he was inside, sitting in his usual place as if he had been there all morning. I stood in the barn doorway for a moment looking at him, and he looked back at me, and the look said plainly that he knew I had seen him at the fence, and he had registered that I had said nothing about it, and we were both agreeing, without words,
to leave the moment where it was. I had begun, by midsummer, to talk to him at length. Not the brief explanatory narration of the wound care days, but actual talk, the kind I had done less and less of since Gordon died. I told him about the classroom, about the particular children who were difficult or rewarding that year, about the politics of the school board. I told him about the garden, what was doing well and what the slugs were destroying. I talked about the Selkirks visible behind the back fence and what Gordon had known about the geology up there, the way the ore deposits from the old mining era ran through the rock, the reason the creek water tasted slightly different depending on the season. He listened to all of this with what I can only describe as courtesy, not understanding, I was not claiming that, but a genuine orientation toward me while I spoke, the kind of attention that is its own form of gift. He would sit with his forearms on his knees and his head slightly angled, and sometimes he would make a brief sound at a pause in my talking, and I began to respond to these sounds as if they were questions, and the conversations, such as they were, developed a rhythm. There was an afternoon in late August, 2 weeks before school was to start, when I was at the woodpile splitting the last of the summer's delivery, and I heard Birch behind me. Not in the barn, which was behind me and to the left, but in the yard itself. I turned. He was standing at the corner of the barn in full daylight, watching me work. It was the first time he had come out of the barn into the open yard voluntarily and without the cover of dusk or dark. I kept splitting. I did not stop and look at him or make any adjustment in what I was doing, because I understood that acknowledging the crossing of this threshold might cause a retreat. I split wood and he watched, and after perhaps 10 minutes he walked to the edge of the woodpile and stood there, and I handed him the next log, and he placed it on the splitting block without hesitation, and we worked together for the better part of an hour, without either of us having decided that this was what we were going to do. In August, he brought me a plant that changed the nature of what I understood about his intelligence. He came back from one of his longer daytime absences, 3 or 4 hours, and he set it on the barn floor in front of me, valerian, specifically Valeriana sitchensis, which grows in moist subalpine habitat above the property line, up on the lower slopes of the Selkirks where the soil is wet and the ground stays cool under the old-growth hemlock. Gordon had pointed it out to me once on a hike because he knew I had trouble sleeping, and had told me his grandmother used to make a tea from the root for exactly that purpose. I had mentioned this to no one, had discussed it with no one on the property, and had never made the tea myself. Birch had brought me a plant that addressed a need he had no observable way of knowing I needed, except he did. I had been sleeping badly that month, the first anniversary of Gordon's death compounding the ordinary insomnias of a woman living alone, restless and short-tempered visibly enough that a being that watched me as carefully as Birch did would register it. He went up the mountain and came back with a specific plant. He set it on the barn floor and looked at me with those dark eyes, and I sat down on the straw bale and pressed my hands over my face and breathed until I was steady. Then I took the plant inside and dried it and made the tea and slept better than I had in months. That is the moment I stopped qualifying. That is the moment when the language I had been using internally, the guarded, careful language of someone who is not yet ready to commit to a conclusion, stopped being useful. Birch was not a wild animal I was rehabilitating. He was a young person from another branch of the world's family who had been hurt and cold and alone in January, and who had stayed because the arrangement suited him, and who was now, in whatever way was available to him, trying to be useful in return. School started in September. I went back to Blewett Elementary for my 23rd year of teaching, leaving the property at 7:30 and returning at 4:30 or 5. For 2 weeks before school started, I spent time in the barn trying to communicate, through patience and the body language that had developed between us, that I would be gone during the day and would return. I do not know how much of this he grasped explicitly. What I know is that he adjusted to the rhythm without distress. The barn door was open when I left each morning and closed by the time I returned each afternoon, which told me he was ranging freely and back before dark. In October, I came home one afternoon to find he had stacked the remaining firewood that had been in a loose pile by the side of the house into a tight, ordered cord against the wall, properly stacked as someone who understood the purpose of stacking would do it. I stood in front of that woodpile for a considerable time. I had no explanation. I had not asked him to do this. He had watched me stacking wood the previous fall, when he was still in the early weeks of his stay, but watching and replicating are different things. I went inside and sat down and understood, with a completeness that I had been resisting, that I was sharing my life with a being that had a social conscience. He was contributing. He had seen what I did, and he had done it in my absence as a form of help. That is not instinct. That is care. The second winter was easier than the first, logistically speaking. I knew what he ate, how much he needed, the patterns of his comings and goings. He knew the property thoroughly by then, and he knew me. The late November storms that shut the road to Balfour twice that December were an inconvenience for me, and appeared to be no inconvenience at all for him. Snow that left my boots soaked and my fingers numb seemed to be weather he moved through without effort, his hair dense enough to function as its own insulation, his body generating heat at a rate I could feel when I stood close to him in the barn on the coldest mornings. I had added a second layer of wood siding to the barn's north wall, run an extension cord from the house for a work lamp, and a small space heater set to its lowest level through the overnight hours. I ordered an oversized sleeping bag through the Sears catalog, rated to -40, and left it in the stall. He used it wrapped around himself like a blanket, rather than zipped inside it, which, given his proportions, made more sense. That second winter produced the specific kind of cold the west arm of Kootenay Lake generates in January, which is not the dry, killing cold of the interior, but a damp, penetrating cold that comes off the water and works into the bones differently. I was spending more time in the barn than the previous winter, not to monitor the wound, which had long since closed, but because the barn had become the place where a portion of my daily life happened. I marked papers out there on winter evenings, sitting on the straw bale with a board across my knees, a habit that had developed from my daily visits and that persisted now not from necessity but from preference. Birch would sit with the field maps or with whatever else he had found to examine, and the lamp would be between us, and the small heater would make the air tolerable, and the barn was, without either of us having planned it, a room we shared. In December of that second year, I brought out a battery-powered radio. I told myself it was for the weather reports, which was true, but not the whole truth. I wanted to see what he made of music. The first time I turned it on to a station playing Christmas carols, this would have been mid-December, the CBC was running its seasonal programming, he sat up very straight and his head went to that alert angle I associated with his attentiveness to sound. I left it on. He listened to the entire program without moving, and when a piece of instrumental music played, a choir arrangement, he produced a very soft version of his chest tones that ran alongside the music, not exactly harmony, but was clearly responsive to the pitch. He was not imitating. He was participating. He had, by this second winter, begun to recognize patterns in my schedule that I had not consciously established. He knew, for instance, that Friday evenings I came to the barn later than usual because I stayed at school to finish the week's administrative work before the weekend. He knew this not because I had told him, but because he had tracked the pattern. On those Friday evenings when I arrived later, he was always awake and alert regardless of the hour, unlike the evenings I arrived at my usual time. I tested this one January Thursday on purpose by going to the barn 2 hours later than my normal time. He was asleep when I arrived, which he rarely was when I came at the expected hour. He woke when I came in, as you do when a visitor arrives at a time you were not expecting. He was tracking time. Not clock time. I am not claiming he understood the 12-hour face or the progression of minutes. But the time that matters in a working life, the rhythms of the day and the week as expressed through the behavior of the person you share your space with. He had internalized my patterns, and he used them. This seemed to me, sitting in the barn on a cold January evening watching him wake from an unexpected sleep, to be one of the most significant things I had observed in 2 winters of observation. Not intelligence in the abstract sense of puzzle solving or tool use, intelligence in the practical sense, the ability to model another mind and use that model to organize your own behavior. That is the intelligence that makes social life possible. He possessed it thoroughly. We had established a communication by then that I find difficult to describe to someone who has not experienced it, because it did not operate through language. Not through sign language, not through any codified system. It operated through the consistency of repeated association, as any 2 beings who spend enough time together begin to develop a shorthand. A particular sound he made meant he wanted me to stay. Another meant he was leaving and would be back. A specific gesture, a brief motion of both hands downward, meant something I came to interpret as calm, or here, or I am here, used both when he was reassuring me and when he wanted to be reassured in return. I am sure I am translating imprecisely. The honest statement is that we understood each other well enough to live together in relative harmony, and that is not nothing. In the spring of 1981, the first of what I came to think of as the perimeter walks began. Birch had started, with the arrival of warmer weather, making a circuit of the property boundary each evening at dusk. I noticed this first by the timing of his departures from the barn, always within the same half-hour window, and by tracking the sounds of his passage around the fence line. After several weeks, I began accompanying him on these circuits, or at least following at a distance, and I came to understand that he was checking the property. Looking at the fence posts where the wire was loose or the ground had heaved with frost, looking at the places where the creek drainage crossed under the back fence, examining the woodlot for signs of other animals. He was, as best I could interpret it, marking the boundary of what he had decided was his territory, and I was, in his accounting, part of what lived inside that boundary. Gordon and I had been together for 15 years, and in that time a version of this same circuit had existed, the morning walk around the property that Gordon did most days. Birch had watched this and had continued it after Gordon was no longer there to do it. He had not been asked to, he had not been trained to. He had observed it as part of the life of this place and incorporated it into his own understanding of what living here required. The perimeter walks became one of the things I looked forward to with a consistency that surprised me. I am not by nature a person who needs ritual, but these dusk circuits of the property boundary, following 40 or 50 yards behind a being who was checking fences and drainage and the signs of other animals with a thoroughness that put my own attention to shame, became the clearest hour of my day. I watched how he walked. The gait was different from what I had seen in the barn or the yard, more deliberate, lower to the ground, the weight shifting in a pattern that covered the terrain efficiently without appearing to hurry. He went around obstacles rather than through them, which told me he was mapping rather than simply moving. When he found a loose fence post, he would press it back with both hands and stand back and look at it, assessing whether the pressure had held it or whether more was needed. He had opinions about my fences. When a section of the creek crossing at the back fence had silted up during the spring runoff and was beginning to backwater onto the property, he spent the better part of an evening moving rocks from the creek bed to redirect the flow, working in the water in the dark with no apparent discomfort from the cold. In May of that spring, he began ranging further in the daytime. I knew this because his return time shifted later, and because the material he brought back came from places I recognized as farther afield. He was going up into the high terrain above the property with a regularity that told me he had destinations rather than simply range. On 2 occasions in June, I went up myself, not to follow him, but because the trail that Gordon and I had walked above the property line was needing its annual inspection. And on both occasions I found evidence of his presence in the subalpine meadow at the trail's end, a compressed area in the grass where a large body had been sitting, looking out over the valley to the lake below. From that meadow, on a clear day, you could see all the way across to the Purcell Mountains on the east shore, and the lake between them, the particular blue of deep cold water in early summer. Whatever he was going up there to do, one of the things he was doing was looking at the view. I found two things on the rock shelf at the meadow's edge that summer, both on separate visits. The first was an arrangement of stones, 7 of them, set in a line along the edge of the shelf with the care that suggested each placement had been considered. Not a random collection. A line, deliberate and precise, oriented along the ridge. The second was a section of bark from a birch tree. There were several paper birches at the meadow's edge, on which a series of shallow grooves had been cut with what must have been a sharp stone. The grooves were not random. They ran in parallel sets of varying lengths that I studied for a long time without being able to determine their meaning, if meaning was the right word. They had the quality of notation, a record of some kind. I left both where I found them. By the summer of his second year, Birch stood close to 6 feet. His shoulders had broadened significantly, and the hair on his back and arms had grown longer and denser, the chestnut color still predominant, but beginning to show lighter streaks at the shoulders, almost tawny in the afternoon sun. His face had changed, the softness of the earlier months replaced by something more defined. The brow was heavier, the jaw was wider. He was adolescent no longer in the soft sense. He was becoming another order of himself, and I watched this with a mixture of pride and unease that I can only compare to watching a student outgrow the classroom. You are glad of it. You are also aware that what is growing past you will eventually move beyond your reach. In late September of 1981, he heard something I did not. We were in the barn in the evening, him sitting with Gordon's old field maps that he had found and taken to examining in the lamplight, turning the topographic sheets with a care that told me the detail interested him, and me sitting on the straw bale reading. He stopped. He set the map down very precisely and lifted his head, and I could see his nostrils working, testing the air that came through the gap in the barn siding above the stall. He was listening to frequencies outside any range I could access, and then he made a sound I had not heard before. Not the usual vocabulary of our daily exchanges. Deeper and more structured, a pattern of tones that seemed to come from his chest rather than his throat, low enough that I felt it in my sternum and only partly heard it with my ears. From the woodlot above the property, after a pause that stretched perhaps 30 seconds, an answer came back. I want to be very precise about what I experienced in that moment because it matters. The response from the woodlot was not a bird call. It was not a deer in distress or a bear communicating alarm. It was a vocalization of the same type as what Birch had produced, deep and structured and tonal, communicating pattern rather than random sound. Call and response. Something up there in the dark timber of the Selkirk foothills was speaking to what was sitting in my barn. Birch turned and looked at me. This was not unusual. He looked at me often. What was unusual was the quality of this look, which I can only describe as including me in what was happening. Not asking permission, not reporting, including. He held my gaze for perhaps 10 seconds, which was long for him, and then he turned back toward the barn wall and answered. Another sequence of those chest tones, longer this time, more complex in its patterning. The exchange continued for perhaps 20 minutes. I sat on my straw bale and listened to a conversation I could not translate, and I was grateful beyond any ability to express for the fact that he had not simply slipped out the door. After it was over, he settled back with Gordon's map on his knees, and after a while he pointed to a place on the topographic sheet. I leaned over. He had his finger on the high ridge northwest of my property, the area around Kootenay Glacier Provincial Park, the high terrain above the lake. He tapped the map twice and looked at me. I nodded. I did not know exactly what I was nodding to, but I understood that I was being told something about where that voice had come from, and I received that as the information it was. The voices came again twice that fall, always at dusk, always from the high ground above the property. Birch answered each time, and each time the exchanges were long and complex. I noticed that after these conversations, his behavior shifted slightly, a quality of distraction that was different from his usual presence. He was still attentive to me and to the routines of the property, still did the evening circuit, still stacked the wood I split, still brought fish to the barn when he had been to the lake. But there was a new quality in his awareness that had not been there before, directed outward and upward toward the ridge. I had been preparing myself for this. I want to say that because it is true and because the preparation mattered.
I had known from the beginning, as you know things you would rather not acknowledge, that Birch would not stay indefinitely. That a young thing of his kind, growing toward adulthood, would eventually return to wherever his kind lived, in whatever configuration his social world was organized. The barn was shelter, and I was company, and those things had been sufficient for a time. But he was being called, and what was calling him was prior to me and more fundamental than anything I had been able to offer. 1982 was the year the balance of his attention shifted. He was still present, still doing the perimeter walks, still bringing fish and occasionally the herbs he had learned I used. But his returns were later, and his departures were earlier, and there was a quality to his presence in the barn in the evenings that was different from what it had been. He was with me and elsewhere at the same time, the way a person is in one conversation while their attention is in another room. I recognized it because Gordon had had it in his last weeks before a long survey deployment, that combination of presence and pre-departure, the mind already partly where the body was about to go. The voices from the ridge became more frequent, not every week, but often enough that the pattern was unmistakable. Always at dusk, always from the high ground above Kootenay Glacier, and Birch's responses were longer and more complex as the months went on. I began to understand that what I was hearing were not casual contacts, but something with structure, the kind of structure that belongs to planning or decision-making. There was a call I began to recognize as recurring, a particular sequence of tones that appeared at the opening of each exchange, and Birch's response to this sequence was always the same. A brief acknowledgement followed by a longer vocalization that changed from month to month. I could not translate any of this. But the structure was there, clear as the structure of a conversation in a language you do not speak, but can recognize as a language. In the autumn of '82, he began bringing things into the barn that he had not brought before. Not food, objects from the wider territory, stones of specific shapes, sections of wood, items that were clearly selected rather than collected at random. He arranged these along the wall of his stall with the same deliberateness I had seen in his organization of the barn tools. I recognized some of them. A piece of quartz from the type of deposit that ran in the ridge above the property. A section of cedar bark, with its grain running in an unusual direction. Others I could not place. He was gathering, and the gathering had a purpose I could feel without being able to name. He carved something that November. Over the course of 3 evenings, while I sat on my straw bale reading, he worked at the far end of the stall with a sharp fragment of rock on a piece of dense hardwood he had brought in, working with a patience and precision that was painful to watch. The kind of pain that skilled, unhurried work produces in an observer. At the end of the 3rd evening, he held up what he had made. A small figure, roughly 5 inches long, carved from the hardwood with a directness of form that was not decorative but functional. It was bipedal. It had a broad head, heavy shoulders, long arms. It had the proportions of a being that was not human but not unrecognizable either. He looked at it for a moment, then set it on the floor between us and looked at me. I picked it up. I held it. I set it back down on the straw bale where he could see I was leaving it. He made the brief sound that meant acknowledgement, or I am here, or the variant of that sound I had come to understand as simply yes. Then he went back to the far end of the stall and lay down and slept. I brought the figure inside that night. I still have it. It sits on the kitchen windowsill above the sink where I can see it when I wash up. It is the truest portrait I have of him, made by his own hands in the year before he left, and it tells me more about what he understood of himself than anything I observed externally. In March of 1983, he left for the last time. I knew it was happening before it happened. He had been spending longer periods out of the barn, returning later, and in the last week he had begun carrying things with him when he left.
Things he had accumulated over his time on the property, a specific stone that he had kept in the stall for months, a piece of cedar bark he had stripped and dried, the old Brunton compass from Gordon's surveying kit that I had never gotten around to reclaiming. When I saw that the compass was gone, I understood that he was making provision for his departure. He was not running away, he was packing. On the morning of March 8th, a Saturday, I went out to the barn as usual and he was there, and I knew from the quality of his stillness that this was the last morning. I sat down on the straw bale and he sat in his corner, and we remained that way for a long time. I talked to him because by then talking to him had become a habit that I maintained regardless of what he understood. And I said the things you say when you love a being and are about to let it go. I told him he was the best company I had known since Gordon, and I told him he should be careful on the high ground in spring because the avalanche risk on the northeast faces does not drop until the snow has fully consolidated in May. And I told him that the barn would be here and the door would be unlatched. He made the sound that meant, "I am here." Then he made it again, and then he stood, and he set both hands briefly on my shoulders, which he had never done before, their weight enormous and warm. And he walked out the side door of the barn and up through the woodlot and over the fence line and into the crown land above the property. And I watched him go until the dark cedars closed between us. I went inside and sat at my kitchen table, and I did not cry for a very long time. And then I cried for a very long time. The first year without him was the hardest, not for the reasons I had expected. I had anticipated loneliness, which came. I had not anticipated the silence around the property, which was different from the silence before he arrived, and different in a way I could not immediately name. Before Birch, the silence of the property had been the ordinary silence of a rural place, full of natural sound but empty of the particular awareness that comes from sharing space with a presence that is aware of you in return. After he left, that awareness was gone, and its absence was as tangible as the absence of a person. I went back to teaching. I kept the garden and the firewood and the morning circuits of the fence line, which I continued because they were necessary, and also because continuing them was a way of honoring what he had brought to this place. I checked the barn each morning out of habit, knowing it was empty, doing it anyway. The 1983 school year was the hardest I had in 31 years of teaching, which is a strange thing to say given that nothing had changed in the classroom. The children were the same age they always were, grade 3 and grade 4, 7 and 8 years old, with their various preoccupations and their enormous capacity for urgency about small things. I taught the same curriculum I had taught for years. I marked the same papers. I sat in the staff room with Barbara and Lorraine and drank the same terrible coffee and had the same conversations about school board decisions and community events. But the classroom had changed in one way I had not anticipated. I had always taken genuine pleasure in the attention of children, the way they watch you when you are explaining a new idea, that combination of effort and trust. That year, every time a child in my class looked at me with that attentive tilt of the head, I thought of Birch in the barn, watching me clean a wound or explain what I was doing or simply talk about my day. The overlap was unexpected and disorienting. It took me a full term to understand what the connection was. Both were forms of trust given in advance of any particular reason to trust. Children trust teachers because teachers are adults who are present, just as Birch had trusted me, eventually, because I was there and kept coming back. The trust is the same kind regardless of what is doing the trusting. The property had its own form of grief, separate from mine. I recognized this gradually, over the months of that first year without him. The woodlot above the property felt different when I walked it, not empty but differently inhabited, like a room whose furniture has been rearranged in the dark. The back fence, which Birch had been maintaining for 2 years, began to show the strain of no longer being checked. A section of wire pulled loose from a post in the September storm, and I found it in October when I did the autumn circuit myself. I reset it with tools I had learned to use but not fluently, and the job took me twice as long as it had taken him. The drainage ditch at the creek crossing which he had cleared the previous 2 autumns silted up again. I found myself doing things that had been his habits, rising before dawn and standing at the kitchen window that faced the woodlot, watching the ridge for the pale gray that comes before the color comes. He had done this, or close to it. I had seen him at the barn door at first light, face toward the high ridge, in a stillness that was not drowsiness but attention. I did not know why I was adopting this habit except that the line between honoring a presence and missing it is thin, and I was on both sides of it at once. The journal entries from that first year are the longest I have ever written, not because more was happening, but because writing was how I was processing a loss I had no established language for. There was no category for this. I was not bereaved in any recognizable sense. I was simply living in a place that was less itself than it had been, and trying to understand why that was. In October of that first year, I noticed the first offering. On the morning after the first hard frost of the season, I went out to split wood and found a pile of bark-stripped alder logs set neatly beside the woodpile. Not logs I had cut or purchased, not logs from any tree on my property. Alder that had been felled and limbed and stripped of bark with clean technique, with a technique I had watched birch use on fallen wood along the creek. 12 logs, each about 24 inches long, ready to split. I stood beside those logs for a considerable time. Then I picked up the splitting maul and split them, and stacked them with the rest, and went inside. The offerings came irregularly after that, not every week, sometimes not for 2 months, then 3 times in a single week. Fish, already cleaned, left on the flat rock beside the barn door where I could find them in the morning. Wild mushrooms, picked and laid in a basket that I recognized, one of the cedar root baskets that a woman at the Nelson market made and sold, and that I had left in the barn the previous summer for some reason I no longer remembered. Once a bundle of avalanche lily bulbs, which are edible and nutritious, laid on the porch step in the early spring before the garden was ready. Once what appeared to be a section of a large honeycomb, the wax still perfect, set in a fold of birch bark on the woodpile. I documented all of this in my journal. Date, what was left, where it was found, any signs of approach or presence. The signs were minimal. Occasionally a pressed indentation in the soft ground along the fence line where something had stood. Once or twice a smudge of the distinctive hair on the fence wire at the back of the woodlot, the same dark chestnut I knew from the barn. Nothing that presented itself clearly. Nothing that asked to be seen. In the spring of 1985, 2 years after he had left, the nature of the offerings shifted slightly. Until then, they had been primarily food. The fish, the wood, the mushrooms. That spring, the first day after the frost broke for good and the creek came up with snowmelt, I found a bundle of something on the flat rock that was not food. Dried plants, 3 kinds, bundled together with a grass tie. I identified 2 of them without difficulty. One was yarrow, Achillea millefolium, which I knew was a common plant on the slopes above the property and which I also knew from the herb book I had bought in Nelson years before to have properties related to wound healing and inflammation. The second was a plant I believed to be fireweed, Epilobium angustifolium, which is edible and also has traditional uses as a remedy for inflammation. The third took me 2 weeks and an afternoon at the Nelson Library to identify. It was a small-leaved plant from the upper subalpine, and the closest match in the botanical reference I found was Arnica cordifolia, a species used by indigenous peoples across the Kootenay region for generations as an external treatment for muscle pain and bruising. I had been having trouble with my back that spring. Nothing serious, the ordinary muscular complaints that come from a decade of carrying boxes of textbooks and bending over small desks, but persistent. I had mentioned it to no one on the property, had not changed my behavior in any detectable way. The bundle of plants addressed the specific kind of pain I was experiencing with a botanical logic that was exact. I dried the plants and made a compress as the library book described, and used it. It helped. The pattern that emerged over the years was not random but responsive. The offerings appeared to track my circumstances with an accuracy that I eventually stopped trying to explain and simply accepted. A bundle of valerian root arrived 2 weeks after I had been particularly sleepless, during the year the school board was proposing to close Blewett Elementary and the staff were lobbying hard to prevent it. Wild rose hips arrived in November of the year my colleague Lorraine had a bad bout of winter illness that spread through the school. Rose hips being the most densely vitamin-loaded wild food available in the Kootenays in autumn. When I broke a small bone in my right hand, 2 of my fingers, in February of 1987, when I slipped on the icy front step, a bundle of comfrey appeared within 4 days, a plant with historical applications in bone healing that is not commonly found at my elevation and that someone had brought from the lower slopes. He was watching the property, watching me. Not in the way that proximity allows watching, but from whatever distance the high ground represented, through means that I have spent many years thinking about and that I do not pretend to fully understand. The Kootenay country is dense with habitat above the tree line, with natural vantage points from which a large portion of the valley is visible, and an observer with the sensory capacity I had witnessed in the barn, that hearing that caught sounds at ranges I could not access, that sense of smell that identified approaching animals hundreds of yards out, would be able to monitor a great deal from the ridge without any proximity at all. He had learned my baseline. He could detect deviation from it, and when deviation indicated need, he provided. In the second year after he left, I added something to the routine. I began leaving things at the back of the woodlot, near the fence corner where the cedar row was thickest. Small things. A piece of the venison I had in the freezer, a handful of oats that I knew he had liked. I was not trying to bring him back. I understood that the arrangement had shifted. He was living his life on the high ground, in whatever configuration his kind organized themselves. And what arrived at the edge of my property were not visits, but something more like correspondence. I wrote back in the only language available to me. The correspondence, if that is the right word, continued for years. Into the late 1980s, into the 90s, irregular but persistent. A thread of connection that I came to regard as one of the constants of my life, in the same category as the lake visible through the cedars and the osprey returning each April. It was not everything. I am not going to tell you that the gifts on the woodpile replaced what I had lost in Gordon's death, or what I had never had in the children I did not have. They did not replace anything. What they were was their own thing, its own category of meaning. And they accumulated over the years into something I came to understand as companionship conducted at a distance that I could not close but did not need to. I retired from teaching in the spring of 1991. 31 years of grades 3 and 4, more children than I could count, and the particular satisfaction that comes from work that shapes things. I did not miss it exactly after I left, but I recognized its absence the way you recognize the absence of any structure that has organized your days. The property filled in around the space, the garden expanding, the woodlot getting more of my attention, the mornings longer. Retirement gave me a different kind of presence on the property, and I want to describe what that meant in the years of the correspondence, because the quality of my attention in those years was different from what it had been when I was teaching. When you teach, you are always preparing for the next thing, the next lesson, the next parent meeting, the next term. The shape of your time is imposed from outside. Retirement removed the external shape, and what I found in its absence was not emptiness, but depth. I could follow a morning further. I could sit at the back fence in the early afternoon and watch the light on the Selkirks without any claim on the next hour. I could walk the woodlot at dusk on a weekday without calculating when I needed to be back at my desk. This change in my quality of attention corresponded with a change in the correspondence. I do not know whether this was coincidence or causation, but the offerings became more varied in the years after my retirement, more specific, as if the depth of my attention was being met with depth in return. The valerian and the comfrey and the fireweed bundles of the teaching years continued, but there were new things. A piece of worked stone that I recognized as having the function of a scraper, shaped from a piece of pale quartzite that did not exist in any deposit I knew of near the property. a section of birch bark on which the inner surface had been rubbed smooth with something abrasive, producing a surface that held impressions. I found faint lines on it that might have been scratches from the tool that smoothed it, or might have been deliberate. A small bundle of downy feathers from a bird I could not identify, soft enough to be from a bird much larger than any common to this elevation. I began going up to the subalpine meadow more frequently in those retirement years. The meadow Gordon and I had walked to on that trail above the property line had been a destination for me since the early years of the property, but I had always gone on weekends when school was in session, and the going had always been purposeful: a hike, a destination, a return. After retirement, I went more often and more slowly, staying longer, sitting on the rock shelf at the meadow's edge and watching the valley below the way Birch had apparently done, if the compressed grass and the stone arrangements I had found there were to be believed as evidence of sitting and watching. I was learning to use the place as he had used it. I understood this clearly by the third or fourth time I sat on that shelf in the late afternoon and felt the quality of what was visible from it. The full west arm of Kootenay Lake laid out below, the town of Balfour small in the distance, my own property distinguishable if you knew where to look, a thread of smoke from my chimney visible on the cold days. He could see my house from the meadow. He could see, in all probability, which room the lamp was in. In the fall of 1992, something changed. I woke at 2 in the morning on a Thursday in October with a clarity that was unusual for that hour, the kind of sudden wakefulness that has a cause even if you cannot immediately identify it. I lay in bed and listened. The lake was quiet, the cedars were quiet, and then I heard it, not from the woodlot above, from the property itself, a series of those tonal sounds, the deep structural vocalizations that I had first heard in my barn 11 years earlier, close enough that I could feel them in the bed frame through the wall. I dressed and took my lamp and went to the window. I could see the barn in the lamplight, and beside the barn, at the edge of my range of vision, there was a shape. Larger than the shape I remembered, much larger. He had been, when he left, approaching 6 feet. What stood at the edge of my barn light was closer to 8. The proportions had changed in the years between, the broad shoulders broader, the silhouette massive against the dark trees. But I knew him. You know people through more than their size. There is a quality to individual presence that does not change with growth, a particular way of holding still that had been Birch's from the beginning. He was not alone. Behind him, at the fence line and barely visible, were 2 other shapes, smaller, both of them, both roughly the size he had been when he left. Young ones. I stood at my bedroom window and held my lamp and looked at what he had become and what he had, apparently, built in the years since the barn, and I understood something that I had not fully processed in all the time since his departure. He had not simply gone back to where he came from. He had grown into what he was meant to be, and he had come back to show me. I stayed at the window for the better part of an hour. He stood at the edge of the light that whole time, and the 2 smaller shapes stayed at the fence, and no one moved toward anyone else. And it was the most complete silence I have ever been part of. A silence full of years and the impossible distance between what we each were and the fact that the distance had never fully closed what was between us. Then he turned, and the smaller shapes turned with him, and they went back up through the woodlot and over the fence line and up into the crown land above the property. And the night was ordinary again. I sat at my kitchen table until dawn. In the weeks after the October night in 1992, I tried to write in my journal what I had seen through the bedroom window, and I found that the usual precision I brought to the journal entries failed me. Not because I did not remember. I remembered everything, every detail, but because the thing I most needed to record was not what I had seen, but what it had done to my understanding of what the previous 9 years had been. He had not gone somewhere else and become something else. He had gone to the high ground and become more fully what he had always been, and he had come back to show me. The younger ones at the fence line stayed in my mind for a long time. They were roughly the size he had been when he appeared in my barn in January of 1980, 5 to 5.5 feet, broad through the shoulders, the same dark chestnut hair. I could not tell if they were his children, or his younger siblings, or some other relationship for which I had no word. What I could tell was that they had been brought here with clear intention. He had brought them to this place. Whatever this place meant to him, the barn, the property, the woman who had kept a lamp burning for him through 2 winters, it was something he wanted them to know about. The years between that first night visit and the end of the decade were the years I came closest to telling someone who was not Dr. Coates. Not from compulsion, from the pressure of accumulation, as a story builds and builds until it requires more than one person to carry it. My niece Patty had been visiting more regularly since her divorce in 1994, coming up from Castlegar for weekends and occasionally for longer stretches in summer. She was 32 and newly alone, and finding, as newly alone people do, that the places that had seemed constraining before had become necessary. She loved the property. She would walk the perimeter in the mornings and stand at the back fence looking up at the Selkirks with an expression that I recognized. The same expression I had worn at that fence for 17 years. Once, in the summer of 1997, Patty asked me directly if I had ever heard anything unusual on the high ground at night. We were sitting on the porch after dinner, and the valley below us was filling with the particular blue that comes before full dark. I said I had. She waited, and I did not continue, and after a moment she nodded as if I had confirmed something she had already worked out on her own. She did not press. She is, in this way as in others, an unusually perceptive woman. The visits through the 90s settled into the pattern I described earlier, 3 or 4 times a year, no predictable schedule. The 2 younger ones came with him less frequently as the decade went on, and I understood this as a natural progression. They were growing, ranging, developing their own territories or social arrangements in the high country. What remained constant was Birch himself, at the edge of the barn light in the small hours, standing with the patience of a being that has all the time available and is not wasting any of it. The late-night visits, as I came to think of them, became a pattern over the following years. Not frequent, not predictable, but recurring. 3 or 4 times a year, on no schedule I could map, I would wake in the night to those low, tonal sounds from the property, and I would go to the window and find him at the edge of the barn light, sometimes with the younger ones and sometimes not. He never came to the barn itself. He stood at the boundary where the light reached and no farther, which I came to understand was a deliberateness on his part, a maintenance of the distance that was appropriate for what we now were to each other. The offerings continued alongside the visits, distinct from them, a separate channel of the same correspondence. Fish in the spring, root vegetables in the fall, species I could not always identify but that were always edible, which told me the selection was intentional. Twice medicines. The valerian again, bundled the same way it had been that August morning in 1980. And once a bundle of Labrador tea, Rhododendron groenlandicum, which grows in the bogs above the lake, and which I had been using for years as a mild pain reliever for the arthritis that had settled into my hands. Both times the offering arrived within a week of the symptom manifesting. I had told no one about the pain in my hands. I had not changed any behavior that I was aware of. He was observing a change I had not consciously signaled. I spent considerable time over the years asking myself what I was meant to do with this story. I am not a person who is comfortable with the idea of secrets for their own sake. I have kept this one because the alternative was a disclosure that would have done damage I could not control or repair. Not to me, though there would have been consequences. To him. To whatever arrangement he had built on the high ground of the Selkirks, whatever community existed up there in the roadless country above the lake. A biologist or a government agency or a journalist does not arrive at the edges of this and leave it intact. They would not mean to destroy it. The destruction would be the natural consequence of documentation, of verification, of the institutional compulsion to confirm and categorize and share. I chose not to be the beginning of that process. Dr. Coates listened to the full account without expression. When I finished, he looked out the window toward the Selkirks and was quiet for a long time. Then he said he had spent 35 years listening to people tell him things they had told no one else, and the ones who carried the strange stories longest were always the ones telling the truth. He told me to write it down. He said it mattered that someone in the world had the full account. I did not at the time think he was right. I had lived with the knowledge so long that sharing it felt less like relief and more like exposure. But I have come to believe he was right, and it is that belief that brought me to this telling. In the summer of 2001, the offering stopped for 6 months, the longest gap in over 18 years. I watched the woodlot each morning, checked the flat rock each dawn, nothing. For 6 months the property was as silent at its edges as any other property in the valley. I was 66 that year. My hands hurt more than usual, and I had taken to using a cane on the uneven ground. I wondered, without letting myself wonder it too directly, whether he was still alive, and whether those two smaller shapes from the 1992 night were grown and gone in their own directions. In February of 2002, the fish returned. Bull trout cleaned on the flat rock on the first morning after the February full moon. I carried them inside and sat down and pressed my hands over my face until I was steady. Then I cooked the fish. The correspondence resumed as if it had never paused, and I chose not to press for explanation. There are things between beings that belong to them alone, and I had long since made my peace with the fact that I was operating at the edge of a life I could observe but not inhabit. The decade from 2002 to 2012 was the decade in which I stopped thinking of what I was doing as keeping a secret and started thinking of it as tending a relationship. The distinction matters. A secret is withheld. A relationship is maintained. I was maintaining, through the continued offerings at the woodlot edge, through the morning check of the flat rock, through the perimeter walks I still made each evening, through the journal I was still keeping, now running to its 4th volume. The relationship required my attention and my consistency, even at the distance it had reached. I did not know if my consistency was registered or appreciated or even perceptible from whatever altitude Birch was operating at by then. I maintained it anyway, on the theory that the terms of the arrangement were mine to uphold regardless of whether anyone was measuring. I told Patty the full story in the summer of 2008. She drove up from Castlegar on a Saturday in July, and I made dinner. And after dinner I brought out the first journal volume and the figure Birch had carved, and the flat rock that had held the first alder logs, and the notebook with the hair samples from the nest and the measurements of the tracks. I laid these on the kitchen table and I told her everything. From the creek in September of '79 to the most recent night visit, which had been the previous May. I talked for nearly 3 hours. She listened. She asked questions, good questions, the kind that went after specific detail rather than general plausibility, and I answered them as accurately as I could. When I finished, she sat at my kitchen table for a long time without speaking. Then she cried, briefly, and I understood from the nature of her crying that it was not disbelief or distress, but the grief she described later as the feeling of a world she had not known existed opening up beside the one she had always assumed was all there was. She asked to walk the property. We went out that evening in the last light, and I showed her the back fence where the fence wire still held the faint compression marks from years of checking. I showed her the creek and the bank where the prints had been. I showed her the old-growth cedar stand where the nest had been built, though the nest itself had long since returned to the forest floor. I showed her the flat rock. Standing at that rock in the evening light, Patty asked me if I was afraid of any of it ever. I had to think about the question, which meant the answer was not simple. I told her that I had been afraid exactly once, in the first seconds in the barn doorway on the 4th of January 1980, before I understood what I was afraid of. After that, no, not afraid, accountable. There is a difference between the two that I find difficult to articulate, but that I understand in my body without difficulty. The last time I saw Patty before she drove back to Castlegar, she stood in my kitchen doorway and asked if she could come back in the fall. I said, of course. She said she wanted to walk the perimeter with me in the evening. I said we would. She has come every fall since, and we walk the fence line at dusk, and the Selkirks go purple above us, and neither of us says much, and the silence we share is the most companionable silence I have known since Gordon. I have been asked by my niece Patty what I believe these offerings mean, whether they are gratitude or protection or something else entirely. My answer is that those are human categories, built from human social logic, and what Birch and I have is not organized around human social logic. What I believe, as precisely as I can put it, is that the offerings are a continuation of the arrangement that began in the barn in 1980. We are still, in whatever way is available across the distance between our kinds, in relationship. The fish and the roots and the midnight sounds from the woodlot are the form that relationship has taken since he grew into what he is and went back to the high ground. They are the form it will take, I believe, for as long as either of us is here to maintain it. My niece asked me if I was lonely. She was asking whether the arrangement I had built, the long correspondence with a presence I could not share with anyone, had been enough to sustain a life. I have thought about Gordon, and about the children I did not have, and about the 31 years of classrooms and the particular way children look at you on the first day of school, all possibility and wariness, not unlike the look of a young thing from the corner of a barn in January. And I have thought about what it means to wake in the night to a sound from the woodlot and know, with the certainty of long acquaintance, that you are not forgotten. Lonely is not the right word for my life. Unusual is closer. I have been shaped by what happened in this barn and in this woodlot in ways that I would not trade, even for the things I did not have. The stone the mountain leaves in your coat pocket eventually becomes part of the way you walk. Last spring, in April, I went out to check the flat rock after a night when the temperature had dropped again after a warm week, the kind of false spring the Kootenays specialize in, and I found something I had not seen before. It was a piece of stone, palm-sized, flat, smooth from a riverbed or a glacial shore, and on its surface, worked into the face of the rock with what must have been a pointed implement applied with considerable patience and care, was a series of marks. Not letters, not any alphabet I know. A pattern of lines and curves that repeated in a rhythm suggesting intention, suggesting language, suggesting that somewhere on the high ground of the Selkirks something was keeping records in a way I had never imagined. I carried it inside and set it on my kitchen table under the lamp and looked at it for a long time. The marks were not random. I had spent enough time looking at notation systems in 44 years of marking papers, the marks children make when they are beginning to understand that meaning can be made stable, can be fixed to a surface and transferred to another mind, to recognize the difference between a tool leaving traces on a surface and a mind leaving traces. These marks had been made with intent. The lines were of varying lengths but consistent depth, as if made in a single session with a single implement at a consistent pressure. They ran in 3 parallel rows, and within each row the individual marks were spaced with a regularity that was not mechanical but was clearly deliberate. I thought about the ash drawn in the barn stall from 33 years before, the floor plan, the rough map of the space he was living in, made with a finger and ash by a being that had been watching the world and accumulating the need to record it. From that to this. 33 years of living in the high terrain, in whatever social and intellectual life his kind maintained up there in the roadless country, and the need to record was still there, and the records had gotten more complex. I do not know what the marks on the stone mean. I have looked at them through the winter and through the following spring, and I am no closer to a translation. But I know what they are. They are the marks of a mind that has something to say and has found a way to say it. That is not a small thing. That is, in fact, the same thing that the first writing was. Everywhere it appeared, in every culture that has left us evidence of its inner life, this is the same impulse, the same reaching. Then I opened my journal and placed it beside the first entry from January 1980. The entry where I described a young thing in the corner of a stall with its arms wrapped around itself and its eyes measuring me for trustworthiness. 43 years between those two things, a stone in a barn and a stone with markings, what began as shelter and grew into something that has no name I know of, sustained across decades and distance by the patient language of fish and roots and wood and the occasional weight of enormous hands briefly at the edges of the light. I do not know what the marks mean. I do not need to. What I have is the figure he carved the November before he left, on the kitchen windowsill. The compass he took with him when he left, the flat rock that held the first alder logs, the pressed indentations along the fence line and the hair caught on the wire, the 4 journal volumes, and the stone with the marks, which I rotate in the lamp's light some evenings, looking at the rows from different angles, as if the angle might reveal what facing on cannot. I understand that I am doing what people have always done with marks they cannot read, bringing more attention to them, in the hope that attention is what the translation requires. Maybe it is. Maybe it is simply a record of seasons and weather and the movements of elk herds across the high terrain, the practical notation of a life lived in the subalpine. Maybe it is something I have no category for. I am comfortable with either. I have been comfortable with things I have no category for since the morning I looked over the top of a stall partition with a flashlight and revised everything I had assumed about the boundaries of the possible. What I know is this: we are not the only ones paying attention to the life of this world. Something up there in the cedar and hemlock of the Selkirks watches the seasons turn on this property and knows when the valerian is needed and when the firewood supply is low and when the lamp in the bedroom window stays lit too long into the night. Something grew from the cold and injured thing in my barn into a being whose voice moves through the dark timber with a complexity I cannot begin to map, and who, for reasons I will never be able to fully explain and have never been asked to explain, continues to find me worth remembering. The flat rock beside the barn door has held, over these 40-plus years, fish and wood and roots and medicines, and once a piece of birch bark folded around a cluster of deep purple berries I could not identify and ate anyway, standing in the yard in the autumn light, and they tasted of the high elevation the way water from a glacier-fed spring tastes of elevation, clean and cold and carrying something of the ground they came from. I think about that taste sometimes. I think about all the specificity of the things he selected, across all these years, for all the things they addressed. He has never gotten it wrong. The barn door is still unlatched. Kootenay Lake is still blue in October. The Kootenays still run up the creek in September, brilliant and purposeful, doing what they have always done in this watershed, unaware of any argument about whether the things that share this world with them ought to be acknowledged or catalogued or believed. The osprey still comes back to the same dead snag above the shore in April. The cedars are still here, the big old-growth ones in the woodlot that were 4 feet across when Gordon and I first walked this land, and that are 4 feet across still, because trees at that age are measured by centuries rather than decades. And I am still here. A retired school teacher at the end of a gravel road south of Balfour, with arthritic hands and a barn that smells faintly of something I cannot name, and a flat piece of riverbed stone on my kitchen table with marks on its face that I sit with in the evenings, the same way I used to sit with Gordon's crosswords, comfortable with the fact that I have not solved it and may not. My name is Alma Vickers. I have lived on this land for over 50 years. I raised something in my barn that the world would tell you cannot exist, and it grew and left and comes back in the night with fish and roots and the occasional sound that I feel in the bones of the house before I hear it with my ears. I have no evidence to offer anyone. The journal is private and will stay that way. The stone with the marks is mine and will stay that way. What I have is this account, given as accurately as I know how, told to the 2 people in my life who have proven they can hold it without dropping it or running with it somewhere I cannot follow. Patty asked me, at the end of the evening when I told her the full story, whether I believed he knew how much he had meant to me. I thought about that question for a while, as it deserved to be thought about. Then I said yes. Not because I had told him, though I had in the particular way available between us. Because the marks on the stone were made by something that understood, at some level my vocabulary cannot reach, that a life could be recorded. That what happened between two beings, across the full strangeness of what they were to each other, was worth the effort of making a mark. That is enough. That has always been enough. The Selkirks are blue tonight, the way they go in the late afternoon when the light comes at a low angle across the lake, and the snow on the high ridges catches it and holds it a few minutes after the valley goes dark. I can see the ridge line from my kitchen window. I have been looking at it for 50 years. I do not know what is up there, in the specific sense. I know what is up there in the general sense, and the general sense is enough to make the looking a different thing than it used to be. Not lonely, not afraid, something worth paying attention to.